Fitzgerald, former Taoiseach. Archbishop of Dublin, Dr. John Neal of the Church of Ireland. Breda O'Brien, teacher and Irish Times columnist. Ronan Fanning, Professor of Modern History at UCD. And Father John Dardis, Provincial, head of the Jesuits in Ireland. That's our panel, and our first questioner is Cora Sherlock.
Thanks, John. What, in the panel's opinion, has been the historical impact of Pope John Paul II?
Right, his impact, historical impact. Ronan Fanning.
Well, I was reading today about how he's been I think the second longest pontificate in history, and I think you have to go back to the days of the Reformation for a comparably long pontificate. And I think if you want to understand his historical impact, you have to take that kind of time span. I think there's very little doubt that his historical impact is going to be less to do with the institution of the church and the organization of the church, and more to do with an extraordinary reassertion of the influence. I won't use the word power, although it was a word that would have been used in the early modern period, perhaps in the Middle Ages, but the influence of the church in world affairs. Because I think the fundamental point is the role he plays in the collapse of communism in Central and Eastern Europe, in the ultimate collapse of the Soviet Union. And there is a kind of curious coincidence of circumstances that he becomes Pope just before Ronald Reagan becomes President of the United States. They have a common view about the empire of evil. It's Margaret Thatcher's period as well.
You're saying chance played a big part in it as well?
Well, much more than chance, because he was an actor. I mean, before that time, Ostpolitik, the opening to the East, was very much part of the Vatican's policy. And when John Paul II became Pope, that just came to a full stop. And he believed that communism could be overthrown in the first instance in his native Poland. And Poland, of course, is one of the largest countries, the largest country which came within the Soviet
And his
bloc.
own lifetime, of course, he had lived through two of the greatest tyrants in history, Hitler as a Pole, Hitler and then Stalin.
I think that's a very, very important point. And I think another very important point, especially for young people who have no recollection of his early pontificate, is he was a cardinal, I think, at 47. An extraordinarily young pope. And what we've been watching over the last few weeks in his dying days, his illness, his symptoms, every ailment sort of spelt out in graphic detail in an extraordinarily transparent way, this old ailing man. What people are inclined to forget, I think, now, is extraordinary energy and vitality. And the extraordinary energy and vitality of his first 10, 15 years. The other point I'd make, apart from communism, is the way that he's an evangelical pope, and I think I use that term politically as much as religiously, making contact with parts of the world in which the Vatican, well, let me put it like this, up until that point had not shown the kind of interest he showed. South America, Africa, Asia.
Father John Dardis, it's 500 million miles he's travelled, 117 countries. I mean, it's an astonishing physical achievement as well. Mm-hmm. And he used travel, he used his papacy in that way, didn't he?
Yeah, the geographical reach that he brought to the papacy was, I think, unprecedented. He used travel, he used communications, terrific communicator. I mean, he really took seriously go out to the whole world, proclaim the good news. I think he felt if that's our mandate as a church, we need to go about doing it. We need to travel, the media, all those means were used. Very modern in that sense, aware of the power of the media, aware of the need to travel. I think travel brought him into a relationship with people, very important. His strength in Krakow as cardinal and as archbishop there, his extraordinary meetings with the youth there. I think he lived out of that a bit, and then as Pope, he lived out of his travels. It brought him into touch with people in a pastoral way. He met people, he listened, they heard him, and then that enabled him, I think, to continue as Pope and to do the work that he did back in the Vatican. I think a key contribution, a key legacy, if you like, is in the issue of faith. The issue today of what role does faith have in a liberal democracy is, I think, a key issue. When you think of Turkey coming into the EU, bringing with it so many Muslims, that's a key issue today. And I think the way he was so patently a man of faith said volumes to people who maybe had no faith, but it said something about depth, interiority, the other, the beyond, that questioned people and challenged people. I remember visiting him. I was in Rome, and we went to Castel Gandolfo to his summer residence, and a small group of us had Mass with him, about 6 in the morning. And I remember arriving into Mass, the small chapel. I was kind of chatting to people as I went in, and seeing this white figure kneeling on a kneeler at the front of the church. And it just startled me, took me aback. You stopped what you were doing. And I think on a global scale, that's what people did. They kind of saw this person and stopped what they were doing, and you sort of thought, faith is important. There's something deep here. There's something different here. I think he brought that message by the person he was. So his legacy isn't just what he did, it's the person he was.
Can I, before going to the rest of the panel, Cora Sherlock, what is your own view on his legacy and his impact?
Well, I think as one of your guests has already said, obviously the fall of communism and his contribution to that would have to be one of the most outstanding achievements of his life. But I think stemming from that, it came really from his overall approach right throughout his life to defend the weak and defenceless members of our society. And I think that follows on as a very important example to us. And I think that's one thing that he would be very proud of. I think also that he used his overall approach to society and to try and improve it, and to improve the lot of people living in difficult countries, places where their freedoms weren't protected, and use that to write encyclicals, leave things like that for us to look back on and to use in our lives, so that we can follow his example and follow a very good example that he set.
Breda O'Brien, what's your view?
It's so difficult to pick out one thing, isn't it? He was such an extraordinary person. But I suppose if I was looking at one aspect of what he has left behind him, it's the whole, I suppose, the importance and the worth of every single human being, that he had this enormous sense that everybody, the weak, the vulnerable, the poor, the wealthy, it didn't matter who you were, that you had an enormous value. And that came from him, for his faith, the idea that we're all, made in the image and likeness of God. And he felt, therefore, that he had to have a role in defending that. I was reading an email from Father Shay Cullen. He's the priest who works in the Philippines, has done wonderful work, against paedophile exploitation of children there. And he was talking about a visit to the Philippines, and the Pope insisted on going to a very poor area, a place called Tondo, and there was a very modest stage railed off and all these eagerly waiting people, and Imelda Marcus decided she was going to gate crash it. And so all the dignitaries had to wait for Imelda, probably while she was choosing her shoes. And so Shay Cullen had walked there, and he was standing 10 feet from the stage just looking around. The Pope arrived with 3 other people. And Shay said the hair stood up in the back of his neck. He said, what Pope would have stood on a street corner with the poorest of the poor and be so comfortable and so happy there? And then the dignitaries arrived without Imelda. She never got her act together. And he said before that he'd been greeting the children, picking them up, talking to people, and then he stood up and he said he delivered a hammer of a speech, which was all about the rights of the people. It was all about their inherent right to dignity, to a living, not to be exploited. And he said, my sense is that happened all over the world. That happened in so many places. He lit so many flames that, in a sense, we have to carry on that legacy. We have to protect those flames, those fragile flames.
What about women in the church? Many of them are critical of his legacy.
I suppose some women would be critical of his legacy, but an awful lot of women would be incredibly grateful to his legacy. For example, I would think that women in the developing world would have felt that they had a champion in terms of their dignity, in terms of their rights. If you look at, say, the Catholic Church in Africa, you find this term Mother of the Church, which women in an area will have, where they have a great dignity within the church, and there will also be a Father of the Church in a kind of an elder role. I think also he brought into play what he called the new feminism. And the bizarre thing about that is that he has kind of leapfrogged a generation with it, that young women really relate to it, because his insistence that we are equal but different. If you say that to a young woman, she'll look at you and say, what's your point? That's obvious. You know, if you say that to an older feminist, she might actually start talking to you about, you know, gender construction and, you know, the way that our society channels us. And I think that he had a great understanding of women and a great love of the opposite sex. And he had friendships with women right from the time he was in primary school, and he was in that underground theatre group. And I think when we look back, I take very much on board what Ronan was saying there, that we can't judge him right now. We have only a limited vision of him right now. It may take 25 years, 50 years before we see the full impact of what he actually did.
Yeah. Archbishop Neil.
Taking up that theme of faith, which John used so effectively there, I would just add one word to it, and that was something that hit me listening to the Pope, was this joy in his faith. It was a very joyful faith. And I think a joyful faith is a courageous faith. And there was this sort of tremendous courage. I mean, to speak for human values often demands a great deal of courage, because you can be up against very powerful forces. And he did speak for human values. The other aspect that I think will be very important in the heritage of the pontificate that's just ended is the way that not only politically had he such an impact on Eastern Europe and on the whole communist world, but also within the church scene, he reached out very much towards Eastern Christians. And I think that maybe the churches of the Reformation were lower on his agenda, but nonetheless it was very important that he did in fact breach or try to reach across, not always very successfully, but the very fact that he was trying to reach across that East-West divide in Christianity was very important indeed. And coupled with that was the tremendous reconciling spirit that also came out of this joyful faith. This reconciling spirit towards other faiths and other faith communities. I mean, to listen today to some Jewish people speaking about the impact of the Pope. And I know that also many Islamic people have spoken about the impact of the Pope. That he actually asked people of faith to look at what they had in common and to celebrate that. And the great gathering at Assisi, a long time ago now, was in fact a pointer to the Christian world that there was no fear in interreligious dialogue. There was no fear in working together.
Did it prosper during his time?
It began. And I think that is, I'm not a historian, but that's where in time to come that maybe an assessment can be made that those doors were opened towards the East. Other things may not have prospered as much as we might have
What about
hoped.
his relationship with your own communion?
I don't think it was probably as high in his agenda that it was, shall we say, on the agenda of Pope Paul VI. Nonetheless, there were different signs at different stages coming out of the Vatican. I think his sheer warmth of personality and his sheer reconciling spirit towards other Christians may not always have been reflected in the sort of statements that were issued.
Were any of them hurtful?
Some of them were hurtful, there's no doubt that they were hurtful, and I don't think they were intended to be hurtful. There was not the same understanding of the Western Church there, and I think many of the problems for Western Christians and ecumenism in the West will have to be looked at again, but after a period, as somebody said, after a winter comes a spring, and I think ecumenically in the West we would hope that we can build on the spirit of Pope John Paul II, not necessarily the steps that were taken at that stage.
Gareth Fitzgerald, what is your assessment of the late Pope?
Well, of course, I agree with what's been said so far, but it's particularly striking his impact globally and outside the Church. I don't think anybody would have thought back in the 60s and 70s that any Pope could have that kind of impact in the world outside. And they were doing their own job within their own church, and indeed some progress in ecumenism at certain times. And Pope John the 23rd was certainly a very striking figure. Also very warm, but with a jovial warmth. John Paul II with more warmth, but a more serious warmth. But that impact is extraordinary, and of course it does pose problems, because it's not going to be easy to find anybody to replace that, regardless of whether the future Pope takes one or other view, liberal or conservative. Where are we going to find her in the College of Gardens?
We have a question on that later.
I know, I won't dwell on that, but I have a worry about that. But it was Grier's personality that he could get across to people in that way. I mean, within his own church, there were certain tensions. He wasn't going to be a man to change the position of the church on various issues. I mean, he'd inherited the contraception decision from Paul VI. He, coming from Poland, wasn't going to be somebody who'd be changing that. It would be absurd to expect that.
But he lived through a period when behaviour was changing by Catholics. So
this is the problem of the church. The Catholic Church, churches generally move slowly. But the pace of events in the world, social changes occurring very rapidly. And I don't think he was the person to make adjustments to that at that time. But he did certainly elevate the church and churches generally to a different role in the world at a time when, in fact, of course, the number of people attending services and so on was declining.
In Europe, yes, but not in other parts.
Yeah, quite.
Yeah.
But I think that ties in. I think that ties in with the question of faith. I really don't think he saw as a priority the fact that religious practice was declining in Europe. I mean, we have this extraordinary fact that here is a pope who's recognised that people are saying he should be John Paul the Great, and yet in Europe and certainly in Ireland, his pontificate coincides with accelerated decline in religious practice and vocations and in all of these other things. But I don't think these were his concerns.
We've a number of people, yes, front row here, yes.
I agree with everything that has been said about his legacy, but I think that for me one of the more enduring aspects of his legacy will be his writings. He has written over 50 volumes of material. He's written, this includes 14 encyclicals, 5 books, one of which was a book on poetry and meditations. And I think this really is something for posterity, for all of us.
Dr. Connell made that point today, Cardinal Connell, the phenomenal scale of his writings in depth and scale and range. Yeah.
Incredible, yeah. And I think that's very important.
Third row there, yes.
Just keeping up the theme of the dignity of the human person and the theme of teaching, like the Pope was a great teacher. There's one area of his teaching that has been described as a ticking time bomb, and it hasn't been mentioned, I haven't heard it mentioned in the media at all, and that is the theology of the body. And that was a theology that the Holy Father gave over a series of catechesis on Wednesdays in the Vatican. Very, very dense material, but in fact it's only now it's starting to be unpacked by a number of theologians. One particular called Christopher West has written a number of very interesting books on the theology of the body, and it describes the relationship of the human person with God as an analogy. There's an analogy with the actual nature of how our body works, the function of our body. It's a deeply spiritual, deeply pedagogical book, a series of teachings, and it's something that I think we will see coming out in the years to come.
Okay, yes. Woman here, third row, yes.
I would have had much more respect for the Pope's record on human rights if he had actually made some strides towards giving people the right to their own family planning, to their own sexual health protection, and I think that is something I think that has been a negative amongst all these things.
Right. Father Tom Stack here.
Oh, well, by the way, I'm sure my friend Professor Fanning won't mind, just a matter of record about the length of his reign. You don't have to go back too far. Pio IX, 1870, was longest. It doesn't, that's at the risk of being temerarious, challenging a professor of history. Anyway, but I think that it just strikes me as I listen that the linguistic virtuosity of the man, I think, was a very significant factor which enabled him, you see, to communicate directly with people. I can remember, for example, in Cuba, his fluency, it seems.
You covered his Cuban visit, didn't you?
Yes, I was there. I covered about 7 or 8 as a columnist for the Irish Catholic, and we met him on a RTE thing, actually, a radio program in Krakow before he was Pope, but that's something else. But I can remember him giving this meaty stuff to the Cubans, actually, and then he'd depart from the script and joke in actually idiomatic kind of Spanish stuff, to their great delight, of course. But the Cuban thing was, I thought, very special, because they're very warm people and they were intrigued with this person because they lived in a rather closed society. I remember arriving at Jose Marti Airport, and the first thing I saw at immigration was the monitor's TV with Fidel there had been on for hours, pounding away with a stack of papal encyclicals on a desk in front of him, and paging to them.
His 4-hour broadcast.
And picking out bits he liked about unbridled capitalism and so on. I said, read that. And then urging all the people, go and see this man. Then we went into from the airport, and every lamppost, there weren't lights and so many of them, but lampposts had Fidel in a suit, one of the 2 times in his public life he'd worn it, going to the Vatican with the Pope, his arm around him, saying, "Messenger of Hope." And then when the Pope arrived, Fidel's speech of welcome on the tarmac was very funny to me, actually, because he had all these prelates in front of him with sashes blowing gently in the wind, and he began by lecturing them on the history of the church and attacked them for Galileo and so on. And then after that, there was a marvellous chemistry, it seemed to be, between himself and the Pope. Whether it was 2 men of authority or not, I don't know, but it was extraordinary. And then his stuff to them was about human rights, about freedom of conscience.
And the American embargo.
Oh yes, 3 times he mentioned that. He mentioned it in a message from the plane, he mentioned it in Havana, and he mentioned it boarding the plane leaving, said that Cuba should be open to the wide world and the wide world to Cuba, and that any nation that restricted that was an unethical action. That was the kind of trade-off we felt that he was having with Castro for the whatever concessions he was getting. But it was an extraordinary visit, the Cuban one, I think.
Yes, 3rd row here.
Just to pick up on what Father Stack said there about hope, I actually happened to be in St. Peter's Square on Wednesday. I happened to be in Rome when he made his last public appearance, and it was quite striking to see a man like stricken by so much suffering, but yet so hopeful in his own ability that he could speak. And it was rather, I think everyone in the square was just so wrecked to see that the fact that the aide pulled away the microphone, because everyone really believed that he was going to speak because he was so strong to appear. I think so many books have been written about him that mention hope, like Witness to Hope, his biography, and Crossing the Threshold of Hope, another book of his. I think that's one historical legacy that he will leave, is that his faith was marked by joy, but it was also marked by hope that we could become better people through struggle, through loving Christ, but we could also build a better world by ensuring that we hoped and stood by each member of the human race. I think that hope is something that he probably will leave, perhaps most importantly of all the things he will.
Woman in the 3rd row here, yes. Yeah.
Another thing that I think that he will be remembered for is, as you were saying, his faith, but also his faith which stems from his relationship with Christ, with the living Christ, especially at this time in the resurrection. It's quite fitting, I think, that he died during the days immediately after the resurrection. And I think that something else that will last is his legacy. His legacy is his relationship with the youth of the world. He is an incredible figure to reach out to the youth. I have the privilege of being with him on 2 World Youth Days, and to see his interaction with the youth and him speaking to the youth and the youth speaking back to him, it felt as if you were actually having a personal conversation with this man. And I know many young people like myself who have witnessed that and who in these past couple of days have felt a loss. So I don't think that it's quite that Ireland is going down in the faith, but I think that our faith is getting deeper, both as a nation and as young people. Our faith is actually becoming a relationship with Christ as opposed to a cultural aspect.
Okay, thank you for that. We have a linked question to that, actually. I'll take it next from Father Johnny Sweeney.
The Pope was last in Ireland in 1979, and Ireland is a very different place to the one that he found in 1979. We've become a more affluent society, more sophisticated, more confident, but our practice of our faith and of faith in general has declined. What do you think the Pope's response would have been had he made a second visit to our country?
Gareth Fitzgerald, you were in public life as a leader from Taoiseach twice during all of that period, and introduced a lot of legislation indeed which mightn't have been on the Pope's agenda when he was here in 1979. What's your view of that question?
Well, I don't know what he would have said, but he clearly would have been unhappy about the decline in practice. But he was a man of hope, and I think that he would be more concerned to encourage people in their spirituality rather than giving out about the fact that we weren't behaving as well as he thought we would. I can't see him as somebody who'd be spending his time criticizing. He'd be trying to inspire.
But at the same time, didn't he stand for a society less secular and less liberal than the one we have fashioned, partly fashioned by your own agenda during that period? Because there are two views of society.
We're using the word liberal in several different senses. It's used in Ireland, curiously, to do with legislation which relates to sexual issues. But in fact, the liberalism which he was opposed to, particularly, was the neoliberalism, the downside of capitalism. Having himself contributed so much to the fall of communism, he turned his attention to the capitalist system and its weaknesses. Now, he wasn't the person to prescribe what particular solutions there were to be to the problems of capitalism, but he was deeply concerned about that, and he was unhappy with economic liberalism, leaving aside any other question. But obviously his agenda in terms of issues like divorce and so on was a conservative agenda, and what else could it be? He was the Pope. He followed another Pope who had taken a particular position of contraception. He wasn't going to reverse that. There's no point.
But wasn't it more than that? Wasn't he hoping, say, in church-state relations, that Ireland might have remained as it was, whereas the reforms that you are introducing would allow people to obey the Catholic Church if they so desired, but would also give space to other people who didn't?
But I didn't meet him to discuss that because I was out of politics at the time. But I don't think that he would have taken the kind of position Paul VI did. It was very negative indeed. And when I met him, a lecture to me in French on the subject of not changing anything, this we keep our Catholic state. And I tried to say, well, we do have some problems in Northern Ireland. There are certain issues like mixed marriages. No, that's no reason to change our laws. I don't see John Paul II taking up the kind of position. I think he'd be more looking at the more positive side of things. So I think that there was a differentiation of some kind there.
I wonder about that because I remember an occasion when Desmond Connell, who was then a professor, as I was in UCD, and he came up to me in the coffee room one morning. It was after one of your initiatives of this kind, Garrett, I can't remember which one. And he said, Garrett Fitzgerald, he said, and he was quite upset. And he said, he is a secularist. And I think this is really the issue. I mean, I think this is the kind of, this is the issue about the question that John is asking. And I think it's a very important issue because it relates to the question about whether or not we should have a National Day of Mourning and all of that, whether or not we are a secular state or becoming a secular state. I have to say I should put my own cards on the table in this regard. I think we are becoming a secular state, and I'm very glad to see the fact that we're becoming a secular state. But I think if you believe in faith, and we've spoken about faith and religious identity being at the center of everything, then I don't think that John Paul, any more than Paul VI, can approve of a secular state.
Yes, John Neal.
Yes, is there not a problem, though, for all churches on this, that in fact the Christian gospel has to be relevant in different societies? It doesn't mean it has to change dramatically all the time, but sometimes it has to reinterpret itself, it has to present itself in different ways. I think this is an agony for the churches, for all the churches, as they encounter changes in society. But I, for one, would welcome the emphasis on the spirituality, as was said so clearly by one of our audience there, the Christ-centered spirituality that he put forward. I'm not so sure about that I could accept the emphasis sometimes on the state back up of a religious establishment in any way, and I'm not nervous of a secular society. I believe the Christian witness can be stronger in a secular society, and it's very hard for us to say at this point exactly what the Pope would approve of or would not approve of. But at the moment, I think this is a question for all Christians, what shape Christian witness takes in a fast changing world with new economic patterns, new scientific discoveries, new ethical
issues.
I was just going to say, new ethical questions. We saw this in America last week. New ethical questions thrown up by the advances of medical science. And I think that the old answers in many of these areas just will not do. Some senior churchman wrote to me the other day, retired, and he said, it was actually on the subject of homosexuality, he said the churches should not be rushing to any decision because we literally have not got the scientific evidence in which we can reinterpret our stance.
Rita O'Brien.
I think, Gareth, you redefined liberalism. I think it would very much depend on how you define secularism. I don't think that he had the difficulty with a secular state if a secular state was truly pluralist in the sense it had space for all voices. But what I think he had a major difficulty with was an aggressive form of atheistic secularism that actually said there is no space in the public square for the voice of faith or for the impulse of faith. And I think no, I don't mean, no. You see, I think the key thing about he did not believe in the deification of any one political system. So when he opposed Marxism, he opposed the idea that this state socialism was the only way in which you could achieve justice. He felt, that this was way too narrow and so on. But when he also was equally scathing about capitalism, he was equally scathing about the idea of putting profit before people. And I think if he came back, I disagree slightly with what Gareth says, but maybe only in emphasis. I think he wouldn't put a tooth in it. And I think that's why young people liked him so much. The young people that I teach, for example, the fact that you knew exactly where he stood on something. And he was always so well informed when he came. I think he might actually have said something of the nature, do not let the opening of a big shopping centre be the high point of your year. And I think he would have said that to us. He said, look, you have a fantastic culture, you have roots, we have so much in common as Polish people and Irish people. Don't throw it away for some kind of bland Euro-US blancmange.
Okay, John Darlis, on this question.
I think, going back to the question, I think he certainly opposed any isms, Nazism, fascism, capitalism, communism, secularism. But I think that, I agree with Breda, that's not the same as atheistic, sort of aggressive secularism. I think there's a difference there. I think he would understand the difference between, a church having the freedom to be a church, a belief system within a society, and it's not necessary to have those beliefs enshrined in law of the society. We've been through those debates in Ireland. I think we finished with them. I think he'd say faith is possible today. He'd say it's not outmoded, it does make a difference. And then at the social level, he'd show us where the difference would be. Refugees, people on the margins, people excluded. He'd say it makes a difference there. So at a personal level, it's not outmoded, we need it. He would believe to be full human persons. And secondly, he'd say, and our society needs it in terms of building a coherent society of solidarity.
Paul de Sweeney, what's your own opinion?
Well, I've heard myself described on Sunday morning as a member of the JP generation, in that the last time the Pope was here in Ireland I was 2, and I can't remember that. And I've grown up in an Ireland that has changed an awful lot. And some of the changes I love, because when I began secondary school it wasn't definite that I'd be able to get a job when I left school. Now I live in an Ireland where people who leave school can easily find employment if they're willing to look for it.
But very few of them, if I may say so, are seeking the employment that you have sought.
Very few. And we're open to anyone that would like to join us. But what John Paul signified for me was someone who affirmed the goodness that he found and yet challenged us to change. And nobody here could say that our society in Ireland at the moment doesn't need to be challenged. Even the example that was brought up about the town centre, to call a shopping centre the centre of a town, that's a seismic change from what we should be about as a society. We're not looking after the people on the fringes as we should be, and that is what Christ came to do, to get us to look after one another, and not for religion to become something that has power, but something that has positive influence.
Second row here, yes.
Well, I think it is very fair to say that for most Catholics in Ireland today, it can be quite difficult to live up to your faith. But I'm gay, I'm Irish, I'm also a Catholic. It's far more important to me, my church is, than the fact that I'm gay. And I don't like to make an issue of it. But the last Pope, even though I loved him and he was my Holy Father, a lot of us felt very isolated by him. I think there's an assumption that if you're gay in Ireland, well then you're not Catholic, you're not interested in church. But that simply isn't true. And I think the media miss it, the church certainly miss it. For me and for many people like me, it's very, very hurtful, and it's becoming very, very serious in the sense that I go to Mass, I take communion, I believe in the church, I believe in the communion of the church. I want to remain part of the church, and I have every intention of remaining part of the church, but it's so much easier to walk away. Now, I know we've spoken about women's issues very briefly there, about how the Pope stood up for the weak, for the infirm. He was, you know, somebody who would go out there and fight for people's rights. But even though I loved him, and I was sad over the last few days to see him slipping away from us, he didn't fight for me. And not only did he not fight for me, but John Paul II, I don't know if it was him who said it or the doctrine of the faith, that we were intrinsically disordered. Hearing things like that from your father is very, very, very difficult. And I wonder, would Father Dardis comment on it at all, just for a second?
Father Dardis?
Yeah, I mean, I hear all the enthusiasm for faith that's there and all the pain that's behind that as well. I think in Ireland the discussion of issues around sexuality gets narrowed down very quickly to a few specific things. You mentioned earlier on there his work on the theology of the body. Very little known about that. His talks written on the Book of Genesis in the very early years of his papacy. And if we read those again and look at the context he was setting for a discussion of sexuality, I think it's much wider and much richer. I think in Ireland, Catholicism, I have to say, I think we have focused too much on sexuality and not enough on social issues and social justice and solidarity. And I think the debate we have to look at, looking at his documents and rereading them, especially those early documents on the Book of Genesis, the danger of taking out one strand and emphasizing that rather than looking at the whole teaching and the whole thinking of the man. That's a danger that I think we need to avoid. So I hear what you're saying, and I'm saying there's a very wide theology and philosophy of John Paul II there that's waiting to be discovered.
Right, we have some callers. Peter Malloy says Irish people don't need a day off. This is on the day of mourning. Don't need a day off work. Instead, they should go to Mass next Sunday. Joan Smith from Galway, we should have a national day of mourning. Angela Garrity from Crumlin, disappointed that there isn't a day of mourning. It's an insult to the Pope considering the affection he showed to Ireland. A lot of that debate turns around, however, definitions of a day of mourning. Some countries have a day of mourning and it's everybody goes to work and the flags are at half-mast and there's a 1 minute silence. So that's close to, in fact, what we are doing. However, we have other questions too, and we'll be back with those in part 2 of Questions and Answers. Join us after the break. Sligo, John Paul was a living saint on earth. Colin Condon has another question.
Thanks, John. What qualities should the cardinals be looking for in electing a new pope?
Right. What qualities now should the cardinals be looking for in electing a new pope? Gareth Fitzgerald.
Well, first of all, regardless of what kind of views liberal conservatives may be, they should be looking for somebody who can carry on what John Paul II did in terms of his global impact and his charisma and his capacity to communicate with people. And the worry is there such a cardinal who can carry that on? Because if you get somebody who isn't a communicator subsequently and doesn't get across, then people will, feel disappointed and upset, and it'll be negative. So he has created a problem. His extraordinary capacity to communicate with the world as a whole does create a terrible challenge for the next person coming, regardless of what particular issues are taken up. And that's what bothers me.
John Dardis.
Well, if you think, the problem of the last century, if you like, the big problem was communism, capitalism, I think, and obviously fascism. I think the problem of this century is north-south, so poverty. The solutions we're adopting in the EU at the moment, and indeed in Ireland, are basically send people back home or keep them out. A very strong anti-immigration.
A sort of fortress Europe.
Yes.
Fortress Europe, and we're subscribing to that. I'd nuance that a bit if I was going on longer, but in general, and I think no matter what we do, if there's such poverty in the south, no amount of visas and retinal scans will stop people migrating up. They'll find means, and if you make those means illegal, they'll find more means, and you're just putting money into the hands of traffickers, because trafficking gets so expensive. So I think you need a pope. What I would love is a pope who, just as John Paul took on East-West, communism, capitalism, I would love a pope who could take up North-South, the total poverty of the South and the increasing affluence of the North. Over 1 billion people live on less than $1 a day in extreme poverty. And I think that can be solved. The statistics show that it actually can be solved.
And this is an issue which should be much more on the agenda of the church.
Much more on the agenda. It is on the agenda of the church in church documents, and indeed of all the churches, I think. But we need somebody who can really take that issue further. As John Paul had, no one would have believed that communism would crumble, and it did. And he had a huge, huge input into that. Can we find somebody in our church who equally has a passion for this issue, who cares about the people of the South, who says, enough, we can solve this, who just like John Paul stood up and could say to George Bush, no to the war in Iraq, somebody who can say no to the IMF, the World Bank, the trade subsidies, all the imbalances that exist. That's what I would love. And secondly, in case it's just a politician, obviously somebody of faith.
Dr. Neil.
I think it's very important that we're not thinking just of somebody who will continue or be the same. I think it's very important that the office has varied at different times in history, it's been used in different ways, and the office is more important than the person filling it. So I think that's a very important point that has to be made at the beginning. But I think the other thing is, the key question to me is not really liberal or conservative. The key question is centralization versus local church. And I think that whoever succeeds needs to look very, very hard at this whole question of the centralizing tendency that has been increasing over the last quarter of a century within the Vatican, and that in order to relate to the north as much as to the south, to the east as much as to the west, there needs to be less centralization, more emphasis on the local church. So in fact, in a way, I think that the next generation is going to require a totally different sort of pope. And that is not to pass judgment on what has happened. It is now to look forward. And I would hope that it would be a much more decentralized church, a church that was of a cutting edge in the southern hemisphere, but also in industrialized Europe, and be able to hear what is happening in Europe and America and in modern Western society.
Rita O'Brien.
Well, I think it's always important to remember that the church doesn't approve of cloning. And I don't think that they will be looking for John Paul exactly in the same way. I think the only quality I'm certain that the new Pope will have is that he will be Christ-centred and that he will be a man of prayer. And after that, I think that you can't predict anything. Garrett asked the question, are there cardinals who can fill these immense shoes that are left behind? There are. And what is actually really heartening is that there are so many of them that actually could do it. Like, I'm thinking of people like Cardinal Rodriguez of Honduras, who has 7 languages, this huge commitment to the developing world that you're talking about. And then people very, very different, like Schönborn in Austria. But the person actually doesn't matter. What matters is that the outpouring of love that there was for this man. People talk sometimes about Pope John Paul as an authoritarian. You don't love an authoritarian. You love somebody who stands for something, who's a person of integrity, that will look you in the eye and tell you the truth. And I think those qualities would be fantastic for somebody to continue on. And I absolutely second everything you say about the scandal of poverty, but also the scandal of the way we treat the elderly. John Paul's last few days were just the most fantastic witness to. When he was handsome and young and charismatic and striding the world, he was not as powerful as when he was totally weak and helpless, and letting us all share.
So the manner of his dying was also
yes.
a statement. Ronan Fanning, there is the point, isn't there, that the very electorate who will now choose the successor was largely appointed by the outgoing Pope.
That's true. I think all but 2 or 3, I've forgotten the exact number. I would disagree with Breda O'Brien on one thing. Person doesn't matter. I think person does matter. and where a person comes from in particular matters. For example, I think if the conclave were to decide that the next pope is an Italian, it seems to me that that would be sending a quite unmistakable signal about their view of the previous pontificate. And I would have thought, going back to what I said earlier about the church being a temporal power, it reminds me that my knowledge of medieval history is vague. Father Stack reminded me. But
it was 19th century history.
Yeah,
well,
true.
But
power in the world, and if they wish to have that power in the world, it's more than north to south. I think it's Europe,
Europe is very
Italy in particular, or Europe. And the question I think they have to ask themselves, I was very interested in hearing Cardinal Murphy O'Connor, because he said, you know, of course, we will be guided by God, we will pray. But he also said in 2 separate interviews, the power of discernment, we have to exercise our power of judgment. And I mean, there is an intensely political decision to be made. And the person, where the person comes from matters hugely. And if they choose an Italian, I mean, one of the decisions they have to take, or are they going to, well, I won't say write off Europe, but leave Europe as it is and try and continue the thrust into South America, into Africa, into Asia. The other question they have to ask, and Garrett raised this point, communication, linguistic skills, they've got to ask. I mean, I'm quite sure there will be many cardinals who would prefer a pope who didn't travel nearly as much.
Colin Compton, who asked the question, hasn't been in, yes.
I would agree with some of the panel's comments that whoever takes over the job has a real tough job ahead of him. But I would like to see a more liberal pope, maybe, with relation to issues like homosexuality, divorce and contraception, and women's equality within the church. And I would also like to see the new pope, whoever is elected, to be have more of a relation to the way society is today.
Okay, man behind you.
Just taking up that topic, it strikes me as strange that most of the Roman Catholics that I know, if I question them on issues such as divorce, contraception, etc., they will go the Protestant way. Also, if I ask them about transubstantiation, most of them won't remember what it means. I think you need a liberal pope to move with the times.
Or maybe we need better education. Maybe that's what we actually need.
Father Stack, you wanted to come in there on this? I thought your hand up. No?
Oh, well, I wanted to just endorse what a number of speakers have said. I think the key issue in terms, Garrett Fitzgerald said, Archbishop Neil indeed, most prominently, this local development of the local church, and let the local church breed, and the dangers of over-centralisation, I think is a key issue. But I don't quite agree with Garrett when he says this is such a hard act to follow. What are we going to do if somebody can't continue in the same strain? With respect, I don't think that's necessary too. And when you think of Pius XII and John the 23rd, this surprise thing, a total change of style, maybe a man who stayed at home and was extremely pastoral, or perhaps could use the media very well, but I don't know whether the traipsing around the globe, and I don't mean that in any pejorative sense now, mightn't be the way. I think that there's something beautiful in change of style, and look, John the 23rd was the perfect example of that.
Man beside you, yes.
Hello. I agree with everything what Father Stack and the panel has said already, but I'm concerned about the role of women in the church. I think, what about the ordination of women in the church and the role of women at lay diaconate? But I am sort of concerned that we will still have conservatism within the papacy, because the cardinals which will elect this pope will, most of them have been elected already by the pope, by the present pope has given them, and there's a danger that we could continue on in the conservative trend.
You have the last word. I thank you for that. I must thank our panel too, Father John Dardis, Breda O'Brien, Garrett Fitzgerald, Archbishop John Neal and Ronan Fanning. And we'll be back next Monday night with the next edition of Questions and Answers. Thank you for watching, and good night.